Hello, everybody. My name is Wynn Brown, and this is a recording of the presentation that I did for the Pima County Public Library on February 24th. The Pima County Public Library doesn't record the presentations because of privacy concerns, and so that's why I'm re-recording it. So thank you, Heather, for the lovely introduction, and I certainly want to thank the Pima County Public Library for inviting me to be the Spring 2022 Writer in Residence. It's such an honor, and I'm really enjoying learning about people's projects and offering what I hope are useful suggestions. This is a program that I know that Sara Lemmon would approve of. As some of you know already, she established the Santa Barbara's first library, and she set up a lecture series there as well. I like to think that she would feel right at home here today. Well, assuming that she'd mastered Zoom anyway. And as soon as I figure out, here we go. To understand why it is I might be obsessed with Sara Lemmon, it helps to know that my background is a mix of journalism, biology, and scientific illustration, a lot like Sara Lemmon's. Really, overall, I like to think of myself primarily as a storyteller. To me, stories are the connective tissue that can attach us to our land, to our forebears, or really even to our entire culture, whether that's local or global. You can see a lot more about the tools I use to tell those stories at my website, which, not surprisingly, is wynnbrown.com. But as many of you know by now, I'm also a graphic designer. Some of you are finding that out early in your projects. I'm already asking you, so what do you want your book to look like? And are you considering images? And what about maps for your book? So as you'll see in this presentation, for this particular book, because Sara was such a remarkable artist, finding a way to showcase her work was paramount. These are just a few of the other books and other projects that I've worked on. Either I was a writer, editor, illustrator, designer, or project manager, or sometimes I was a combination of all of those. And you probably won't be surprised to hear that of all those projects on the previous slide, the one that I'm proudest of is this one. And oh my, I am so thrilled that it is a Southwest Books of the Year top pick. And I'm also have to say that as a designer, I love every choice made by the University of Nebraska Press designer and formatter, Annie Sheehan, and formatter, Michaela Collender. So today, what we'll do is we'll go through these 5 elements. For those of you who've attended some of my other presentations, first of all, thank you for that. And you'll find that this one is a little different because in this one, I'm going to be focusing on really the nuts and bolts, you could say the concrete and the rebar of how I went about building this particular book. But at the same time, I don't want to assume that everybody's read the book or knows about Sara Lemmon. So first, I'll zip through a bare bones timeline of Sara's packed and very productive life. Just enough to give context for those of you who are new to Sara, but not so much, I hope, that it's going to bore people who've already read the book. And if you want a more thorough tour of her life, you can find that in various other Zoom recordings on my website. Then after that, I'll give you a brief overview of the project itself, the story behind Sara's story. And after that, we'll dig deeper into the research and the tools that I used and the process. And then to wrap up, I'll tell you about some recent and very exciting developments for her work. So let's zip through the story of Sara Ellen Plummer Lemmon, for whom Arizona's own Mount Lemmon is named. This really will be the Sara Lemmon Cliff Notes version, 90,000 words smushed down to 18 slides. Sara was born in New Gloucester, Maine on September 3rd, 1836. So that means that her biography was published the year she would have turned 185. She was the middle child of 5. She went to school in Worcester, Mass, and then in Brooklyn, New York. In 1862, she was accepted to the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, where she studied chemistry and physics at night while teaching both calisthenics, which is what we now refer to as gym class. And because she'd always been artistic, she also taught private art lessons during the day. In a really, what I find interesting bit of foreshadowing, she also made time to volunteer at New York's Bellevue Hospital as a nurse for wounded Civil War soldiers. And you'll see why that's foreshadowing. Again, that's very ironic because Sarah's own health was very fragile. She had terrible respiratory problems, bronchitis, constant colds, and at one point she nearly died of measles, which she caught at Bellevue Hospital. In 1870, at age 33, Sara Plummer nearly died yet again, this time of pneumonia, and she realized that her life depended on escaping the bitter northeastern winters. She made the huge decision to move across the entire country all by herself to California, where she didn't know a single soul. This was not an easy jaunt. The railroad had been established, but it was not reliable, and it wasn't a good way for a woman to travel alone. So she went the long way around by steamship. She disembarked in San Francisco, where she stayed for a month, and then she realized after several weeks that her lungs still were not up to the cold and damp. So she headed south, and she settled in Santa Barbara. She discovered Santa Barbara itself was lovely. The climate was idyllic compared to Manhattan winters. She also found that the intellectual stimulation was a far cry from New York City. This is when she wrote to her sister, Maddie, "'Tis like death to me to be idle." And worse yet, there was no library. So Sara being Sara, she rounded up donations and hundreds of books, and she established Santa Barbara's first library. As she recovered her health, she took long walks along the beach and in the hills above Santa Barbara. Sara had always been insatiably curious, and she ended up teaching herself botany by using her artistic ability. This earliest surviving painting is most likely a flowering fruit tree, maybe an apple. She still missed the stimulation of New York City, so she also set up a lecture series, and that may be what brought this man to Santa Barbara. This is John Gill Lemmon, usually known as JG. And in 1876, he was a rising Western amateur botanist. And that was when he showed up in Santa Barbara, quite likely at a lecture at Sara's library. And it was 2 years after this picture was taken. Like Sara, he too had terrible health issues, but his were because of his prisoner of war experiences. He was a Civil War veteran from the Union Army and had barely survived spending months in both the Florence and the Andersonville prisons under just absolutely horrific conditions. JG was soon smitten with Miss Sara Plummer, and a year after they met, he worked up the courage to propose to her, and she turned him down. She said she loved him deeply, but she felt that they were both too sick too often to marry. So they remained affectionate pen pals for the next several years. Then Sara got sick again with spinal meningitis in 1880. She nearly died yet again, and apparently that changed her mind because the two of them were married on Thanksgiving Day, 1880, or as Sara described it to her sister Maddie, they plunged into the matrimonial vortex. She was 44 and he was 48. She relocated from Santa Barbara to Oakland and moved in with JG and his mother, but apparently that all worked out fine. At Sara's suggestion, they delayed their honeymoon until the growing season when they could botanize the Santa Catalinas. And that was where they spent 3 weeks trying to reach the top from very close to what we now know as Sabino Canyon. This one's for those of you who are accessing this Zoom and you're not in Arizona. Believe me, Arizona is not all flat, sandy desert. So within a couple of weeks, they realized that they were absolutely not going to be able to reach the top, that it was just too rugged. So they went back to town and they went around the backside, or the south-facing side, north-facing side of the Catalinas and got in touch with a man named Emerson Oliver Stratton, who owned the Pandora Ranch. Stratton knew a route to the top, and he provided pack animals to the 9,157-foot peak. Much later, he wrote, "We went to the highest peak of the Santa Catalinas and christened it Mount Lemmon in honor of Mrs. Lemmon, who was the first white woman up there." The following year, the Lemmons returned to Arizona, this time based in Fort Huachuca, down there in the south, very close to the Mexican border, where they spent several months. And as you'll see, that area is very important because this is where most of her surviving paintings were done. From then on, generally they were out in the field during the growing season collecting plants. They then spent winters at their herbarium in Oakland, eking out a living, or trying to, by selling specimens and seeds to collectors. They produced several books illustrated by Sara, and they did frequent botany lectures. In 1903, they moved to what would become their final home. This photo always makes me feel much better about the mess in my own office. If you ask a Californian, they would tell you that Sara Lemmon's most well-known and important accomplishment was in 1903, when after a 10-year battle, the golden poppy was named California's state flower. Arizonans might argue with that, since I think most of us believe that Mount Lemmon is more significant. But what was really significant was that at 5:12 a.m., April 18th, the San Francisco earthquake convulsed the entire Bay Area and more. And as if the earthquake wasn't enough, the fires came through, and among other things, the fire gutted the California Academy of Science. And that's where many of Sara and JG's specimens were stored. And I believe that a lot of her work was there as well, her drawings and her paintings. I believe that much of Sara's work went up in flames at that time, and I would so love to be proven wrong. Although she wrote her family, "We are safe," though tremendously shaken, both Sara and JG were shattered by the loss of so much of their work. JG's health, which had always been fragile, continued to decline over the next year, and he lost much of his vision. He died of pneumonia in November 1908, 2 days before their 28th wedding anniversary. He was 76. After he was gone, Sara never really recovered. In fact, her sister Maddie believed that Sara's cognitive decline really began with the trauma of the earthquake. The family finally felt forced to commit Sara to Stockton State Hospital on April 22nd, 1916. The diagnosis was dementia. It's terribly sad. She had become profane, and they had to prevent her from leaving the house, as they said, unclad. She died January 15th, 1923, 99 years ago in January. The two of them are buried together, and I love the fact that on the gravestone it says partners in botany. They're buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland. Because of COVID, I couldn't get back to Oakland to photograph the headstone for the book, so Sara's great-great-grandniece, Amy St. John, was kind enough to take this photo for the book. Okay, so that's definitely the light version of Sara's life, but I hope it gives you an idea of why it is I became so intrigued with her. And when I first started this project, I really had no idea what I was getting myself into. About 15 years ago, I first learned that Arizona's Mount Lemmon is named for a woman botanist of the 1800s who climbed it on her honeymoon. That was pretty intriguing. Later, I learned that the University of California and Jepson Herbaria Archives in Berkeley had 6 linear feet of material on the Lemmons. I didn't know if it was letters or drawings or paintings, but my first thought was, somebody should do a book. I now know there lie monsters among those words. In 2015, I made the first of 3 trips to the Jepson Archives in Berkeley to see that material. And that was when I discovered that there were hundreds of pages of Sara's handwritten letters, 1,200 pages actually. Sara was very close to her family. She wrote home every week, mostly to her father and to her sister, Maddie. I didn't really know what to do at that point. I'm not a trained historian, and I only had 3 days there. So when in doubt, capture. I photographed the first 600 pages with my iPhone. I went home. I quickly, before anything bad could happen to them, moved the images to my hard drive, and then I started reading. And sometimes, as you can see, that was a little bit challenging. Sara was a frugal type. Paper was thin and expensive. And so to save paper, she often would write on one side of the page, flip it over, write on the other side, flip it back over, turn it sideways, and write across her own handwriting. This was actually quite common at the time. It's called cross-writing. In 2016, I went back to Berkeley to photograph all the rest of the letters. Then in 2017, I learned that Sara's family had recently donated 2 boxes of her paintings that had been stored in Hawaii. And here they are. Tragically, these 2 boxes hold all that's been found so far of Sara's artwork. They're all watercolors on paper. And both because of their age and because of Hawaii's humidity, they're much too fragile ever to exhibit or even to handle. They're so fragile that the archivists were really afraid to even look and see what was in the box in case they crumbled. So now what? And this isn't advancing. Here we go. I was faced with 1,200 pages of correspondence written during a time I didn't know a lot about, several dozen paintings that I wasn't able to see, and masses of references that I was rapidly losing control of. And the questions I had were, how do I corral all this? Where do I want to go with this? How do I set up a system that will grow with the material as I continue to gather more material, and that I'm not going to have to restructure down the road? What I quickly realized is that Sara was more than a book. And she's really a whole project, thus the logo that I designed. Phase 1 was the book. Phase 2 was to preserve her artwork the best I could. Phase 3 would be to continue spreading the word about her. So it now appears that Sara and I are going to be joined for quite a while longer. My husband, Dave Peterson, says he feels as if he's married 2 women. So I hadn't even started the book yet, and I already had dozens and dozens of references, books, articles, websites, images, scraps of text, and Scrivener came to my rescue. Besides, how can you not love a company called Literature and Latte? As software goes, it's pretty cheap at $49, and that's a one-time, not a monthly cost. It's available for Macs or PCs. You could even get it for your phone, although I can't imagine anything much worse than wrangling this particular book on my phone. But some people do that. Some people love Scrivener for writing. It does have a word processing component. I tried it. It was fine, but I use Word for all my other work, and I didn't want to confuse myself with 2 different word processors. Those of you who are novelists might want to check it out, especially because it also has a function of being a kind of electronic corkboard where you can put a scene on a note card and an electronic note card and move it around. You could, for me, I think of it as a filing cabinet with folders, or maybe a huge, infinitely expandable binder with an infinite number of tab sections. So you can see the folders within folders here. And then when you click on one thing, it'll expand it and show you what's in it. We can zoom in. Here you can see the Arizona folder. And Sara is much more than an Arizona story. I really think of her as a national story, but you can see this particular folder, again, zoomed out and expanded. And you can drill down even further. So this is within the Catalinas within Arizona. And this is looking at one plant that the Lemmons discovered. So What about all those letters? Those 1,200 pages of correspondence. The next question was, how am I going to track all of those? And most important, if there's some detail I need to check later, how can I set up a system so that I can go back to it? This is what I refer to as the project brain. For me, it's a way to log all those 1,200 pages of letters, and that alone turned out to be a 2-year project. All it is a very simple word table, but for me, it functions as a threefer. It's a timeline of Sara's life through her own words, and also includes national and global events for context. Secondly, it was a way for me to track which content was in which images, because each letter is a different image. And then 3, it's a progress report, so I could see where I was. So here's a close-up. As you can see, the green bars separate out the different years, and then the columns are the date, and then there's a short summary of what each letter was about, then the image number. Sometimes they're duplicates, because when I went back the second year, sometimes I shot the same letter twice. So here's just one reason I'm really glad I did it this way. Do you remember I said that I wanted a way to track down a detail later if I needed to? Not too long ago, in February, a retired English teacher in Japan emailed me. He absolutely loved the book, said very nice things about it, but he also pointed out that on page 29 of the book, I wrote that Sara had asked Maddie to send a copy of The Wind in the Willows. And if you happen to have your copy of the book handy, check it out. Sure enough, there it is, 1/3 of the way down the page. This very nice man pointed out, oh, so politely, that Sara wrote the letter in 1871, but The Wind in the Willows wasn't published until 1908, nearly 40 years later. Uh-oh. My first thought was, oh, he's got to be wrong. Surely he's wrong. No, he was absolutely right. And sure enough, there on page 8 of the Project Brain, it says, details about which books to send, Wind in the Willow. The red dot over to the left means that I transcribed that letter. I know from the numbers on the right that it's image 2463, and that there's a duplicate at 4534, and that particular letter is 540 words. So let's go look at that specific letter. Image 2463 is on my hard drive, and sure enough, there's her letter, dated May 1st, 1871, from Santa Barbara. Hooray, the system works. That's very gratifying. So let's zoom in. Oh, look at that. Talk about wishful transcription. I love Wind in the Willows, but it's not what it says. It says Under the Willows, which actually I had never heard of. So of course I ran to Google, which took me to Amazon. And the first entry that came up for Under the Willows is a fast-paced paranormal mystery published in 2020. Most likely I'm thinking that is not the right Under the Willows. I kept digging. Aha. James Russell Lowell was a poet, a New Englander, like Sara, a Unitarian, like Sara, an abolitionist, like Sara. Chances are excellent that they knew each other. Thank you so much, kindly English teacher in Japan. And thank you, Project Brain, and the second printing of the Forgotten Botanist, that will be fixed. Okay, so now moving on to those 2 boxes of paintings. What about her artwork? Back in 2017, to get these photographs, I found a local art conservator in Berkeley, and I hired her for a day because I wanted to see what was in those boxes. I hoped that I could get some photographs for the book that I had not yet written and that I didn't yet have a contract for. But I found Susan Filter. Because she had treated John Wilkes Booth's diary, I was pretty sure that she could be trusted to handle Sara's work. So she, Dave, and I spent hours photographing every one of what turned out to be 276 pieces of work in those two boxes. We photographed them both front and back because often there's a wealth of information written on the back of many of them. Some of them are just shreds. The insects have just done a number on some of the paper, but they still have notes on the back. And in this one, if you're familiar with her writing, as I am, this one says pink California poppy, yellow California poppy, and Mariposa lily. And if you turn it over oh so carefully, there's the pink California poppy, the yellow one, and the Mariposa lily. But if you also look closely, it turns out that this particular painting is not even by Sara. It's by her teacher, Adelia Gates, who has work in the Smithsonian. Fascinating story, but I'll have to save that one for another time. Most of the paintings that are in the boxes are probably by Sara, but since some of them aren't signed, who knows? However, this one is signed. This one of a gentian is a really lovely painting and somehow is totally spared from insect damage, fungus damage, mold damage. You don't see what's called foxing, the brown spots that we saw on the apple blossom, and it's also signed. This one's also signed, this one, the Columbine, and she did it in Fort Huachuca Canyon, Arizona on Independence Day, July 4th, 1882. So the next question becomes, how do I keep track of these 276 pieces of paper? How do I keep track of the notes that are on the back? What's the best system? So I'm using a database program called Tapforms. When I first started doing this, I became a beta tester, and that's pretty funny considering I know nothing about databases. But it was perfect for what I needed. I tried to use Excel, but Excel doesn't handle putting in thumbnails very well. But this one includes a thumbnail. It includes the assigned image number, the plant ID, the plant location, and the artist. So I'm still working on this, and we'll keep you posted. So then another piece of it is, what about the dreaded platform? I kept reading about platform and how no publisher will even look at you if you didn't have lots and lots of followers and if you didn't have a platform. And at that point, I wasn't even quite sure what a platform was. So here's what I did. I set up a newsletter, and partly because I'm lazy, and I was tired of individually answering all the people who said, so whatever happened to that book that you were working on? And eventually, partly of what I wanted to do also was I wanted to plant a flag in sort of Sara Lemmon land to say, I'm claiming a piece of this territory. So that was another reason to set up the newsletter. This one that you see on the screen is newsletter number 7 of October 2018. It now goes to around more than 850 loyal readers who I consider my very large advisory board. I'm now up to issue 39. I do get anywhere from 20 to 200 responses every time I send it out. And here's the important part. If you decide you want to do this for your project, I answer every single one of those, not always in a really prompt way, but I do answer every one of them. And it takes time. But at the same time, very few of these people unsubscribe. And they are, to me, just a huge fan base. So each newsletter has snippets about Sara. It's free. I only send it out if I have something to announce. And I'm also happy to say that it won a National Newsletter Award last year from the National Federation of Press Women. And if anybody who's interested, who's on this call, if you email me at win@winbrown.com, I can add you as a subscriber. So the next question is, and this is a big question, how to publish this? Do I want an agent? Did I want to go the traditional route? Did I want to do independent publishing? some people still refer to as self-publishing. And as many of you know, these days you can publish a book independently. And I'm a huge fan of independent publishing. And in fact, helping authors publish their books independently is a large part of how I make my living. I do have both the editorial skills and the design ability to build what could be a beautiful book. And I always had that as a backup plan. But even though my ego really wanted the control, I also felt that the credentials and the heft of a solid traditional press was the best strategy for this particular book. Because it's nonfiction, I first wrote a book proposal. And as many of you know, a book proposal can be almost as much work as the manuscript. Mine is 100 pages. You can learn more about book proposals if you look on my website. There's the sample, the book proposal that I sent to Nebraska is on the website. You're welcome to download it and use it as a model for yours. I also think it's not a bad idea for fiction writers, for novelists to put together a book proposal. They're not required, but I think it's a really valuable process to figure out what your book is about and who it might appeal to. So next, I researched 54 possible publishers, and I sent queries to 24 publishers and agents. And my backup list had another 30. I received 24 rejections, and yes, of course, I tracked them all because I didn't want to get confused and send the same proposal to 3 or 4 different places again and again. In this case, I used an Excel spreadsheet. I know this is much, much too small for you to read. The important thing are the categories. The number of whether it was the first, second, or third that I'd sent out, who the agent and publisher was, what my connection was to them, in other words, where I'd met them, what that particular agent or publisher was looking for, what their submission guidelines was, when I sent the query, and what kind, and whether I had to send another query because often they don't say anything and you wait 6 weeks, and I would send a follow-up, and then what their response was. The 25th query was the magic one. In November 2018, I attended the Nonfiction Now conference in Phoenix, where I met one of the acquisition editors for the University of Nebraska Press. I gave my 1-sentence elevator pitch, which you should all have for your books. In my case, it was, "Hi, I'm Wynn Brown, and I'm writing the biography of Sara Lemmon, the 1880s botanist and artist for whom Arizona's Mount Lemmon is named." And you should all have your elevator pitch memorized. She immediately handed me the card for her boss, another acquisition editor. And I contacted her, wrote her a query letter, and she said, yes, please send me the full proposal. And in October 2019, I signed a contract with University of Nebraska Press. Something else that you writers might want to know, many academic presses don't just do stodgy academic textbooks. Many of them have a separate imprint for general interest readers. And I'm especially pleased that this book, The Forgotten Botanist, is under the trade imprint. It's a Bison book for general interest readers. They also do accept historical fiction, which some of you might find particularly interesting. Then I wrote the book itself. As you can tell, I have excellent office help. Writing a book is never easy, and especially as all this was happening while I was working as a full-time freelancer and dealing with various major life events. But after everything that I had already done, going through these 1,200 pages and dealing with the artwork, it was simply a question of sitting down and getting accurate words on the page. Sometimes they weren't all the right words, or they weren't in the right place. But then came the art of editing until I felt that I had the right words in the right place. 1 year later, late on a Friday night, last October 2021, UPS delivered a box filled with books, and a really, truly beautiful book at that. As I keep saying, I could not be happier with every aspect of working with the University of Nebraska Press. So at that point, I kind of thought that I'd get to kick back a little, take a bit of a break before the residency started with the library on February 1st. Anybody who knows me well can tell you that's probably not going to happen to me. I had another book deadline on January 31st. Plus, in December, I gave a Forgotten Botanist talk to the Sabino Canyon Volunteer Naturalists. They're a terrific organization. Check out their website, sabinonaturalist.org. And as I always do during presentations, I mentioned how tragic I think it is that this exquisite artwork of Sara Lemmon's is jumbled in 2 boxes. The boxes are too small. And I mentioned my goal of using whatever proceeds there are from the book toward the next step, paying the conservator and getting archival boxes and protective sheets so that each piece of artwork can be conserved in the manner that I think they deserve. Doing this for just 30 paintings for starters, I figured would probably be about $5,000. And so I said to them, if you have any suggestions about foundations or grants where I can apply for funds, please email me. So they did. The following week, they emailed me, asked me to come back and give another talk specifically about what would be involved to preserve her art. And the next thing, they agreed to giving me $3,500 toward preserving Sara Lemmon's artwork. The following week, I told somebody else about that, and she immediately said, I love Sara's work. I love what you're doing. And she pledged $1,000 as well. So with the money that I've already getting from the proceeds of the book, plus these 2 remarkable donations, plus more that have come in since, I do now have the $5,000, which will cover the cost to stabilize and rehouse the artwork, at least 30 of her paintings. I've now been in touch with the archivists, and they are very excited about the project. So what does preservation of Sara's artwork actually mean? So it's very important to realize and to recognize I am not using the word restoration. Some of these works are just too far gone for restoration. You can't restore paper that's simply not there. But what I can do is follow what Susan Filter recommended way back in 2017, stabilize and rehouse the work to make sure that it doesn't deteriorate any further. Susan Filter has now retired, but I tracked her down, and I'm delighted to tell you that she says she's happy to come out of retirement to conserve Sara's artwork. And at $1,500 a day, her time and her expertise and vast experience is the most expensive part of the project. Here's a screenshot of the folders. These are made by a company called Gaylord. This was the price as of February. They may have gone up somewhat since then. And these are the boxes that would be that each folder would go into. So we have now managed to coordinate our schedules, and all this will be happening in late August, which is just incredibly exciting. So what about phase 3? Phase 3 would include a second printing of the Forgotten Botanist. And I'm recording this in May, and I'm very excited to tell you that the first printing is just about sold out. What that means is that I will need to pay University of Nebraska Press another, what's called a subvention. And for color reproduction, and it would be criminal to do this book in black and white, authors usually are asked to contribute toward the color reproduction cost. And for 2,000 copies, that's about $2,000. I'll continue the promotional activities, continue giving these talks. Botanical illustration illustrators are on board and very excited about this. There are also several people who are interested in doing curricular materials about botany and about Sara, teaching kids about using art to understand more about plants. Another idea is something called a catalogue raisonné, which is basically a very high quality, high resolution on catalog of her artwork. If you do it in print, they're horribly expensive. But my idea is to do high quality digital scans and then have the catalog be available online for anybody to see at no cost. So those are, other ideas that are kind of percolating along. And if you have any ideas that you want to run by me, just go ahead and email me, or again, ideas of funding, that would be great. So that's where the Sara Lemmon project is for now and how it got here. I really hope you've enjoyed this story and that you agree with me that Sara really is another hidden figure of both science and art who so deserves a mountain in her name and a book, and that her work deserves to be preserved. The book, The Forgotten Botanist, is of course available at your local library, although you might have to place a hold. And if you choose to buy it, I've been encouraging people to support their local independent bookstores. In Tucson, that's mostly books, in Antigone, books, but do please support your independent bookstore wherever you are. Again, my very deep thanks to Pima County Public Library for the Writer in Residence program and for the opportunity. And thanks so much to all of you. And I'm going to now stop sharing my screen. And if you have any questions, do feel free to email me at wynne, W-Y-N-N-E, @wynnebrown.com. And thank you so much. Bye-bye.